evening and welcome. My name is Robert Dijkgraaf, Director of the Institute, and a great pleasure to welcome you to this public lecture. As always, there will be time for questions after the lecture, and then there will be a reception in the common room of Fould Hall afterwards. Very privileged to introduce today's speaker, Yve-Alain Bois, our professor in the School of Historical Studies and art historian. He's a specialist, particularly in 20th century art, European and American. He's actually, that's the great thing if you're an art historian, you have these kind of great artists as your friends and interests. You know, as a physicist, you just study a particle or something, but you have this wonderful artist that he is so close and has worked so much of. Matisse, we heard today about Picasso, Mondrian, Barnett Newman, and of course Ellsworth Kelly. Yve-Alain has curated and co-curated a number of influential exhibitions on these and other major artists. There are actually two kind of books I would really love to recommend that came out last year, both by the hand of Yve-Alain, that are absolutely stunning both in their content and in the way they have been prepared. The first is Matisse in the Barn Foundation, which includes a long essay he wrote that addresses the evolution of this wonderful piece that you can see in the Barns, the dance, and its role in Matisse's career. It was actually a kind of a stunning review of it in the Financial Times, praising it, and I really like to quote the last line, which says that, you know, there was no book that was published that year that so triumphantly combines erudition with pleasure. The other book that came out was the first volume in this massive project that Yve-Alain has undertaken, which is the Catalogue Raisonné of Ellsworth Kelly. Of course, one of the greatest American artists, modern artists. He, as you know, he actually passed away in December. And, but the first volume that came out, volume 1, that describes his work from 1940 to 1953, is absolutely gorgeous and incredibly kind of spectacular, and some of you might have heard Yve-Alain talk about it, but it's again a book that I recommend, if only of its size, you know, this massive object, beautifully formed. And just a little anecdote, because I know that Yve-Alain was working on it for so long, so I look in the book and can see where can I find the author's name. And I look in the pages and there's no mention of your name. And then only I look at the cover of the book, and very short, there are 4 letters, Bois. So minimalism, very elegant, I would say. Elegant understatement. Even as I said, is one of the most distinguished art historians here working in the United States. He obtained his doctorate from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, started his career at the CNRS. Then he joined the faculty of Johns Hopkins in 1983. He remained there till 1991 when he moved to Harvard, where he accepted the Joseph Pulitzer Jr. Professorship of Modern Art. He was tormented there, also being acting chair, and then finally liberated by coming here to the Institute in 2005, where he has been working unencumbered, but on this kind of wonderful long-term projects. And I feel today we're kind of privileged to have a little, I would say, kind of divertissement. You're going back to an old love, Picasso and Abstraction, Encounters and Avoidance. And as he announced, he will examine several encounters, or rather false encounters, of Picasso with abstraction, and also discuss how that led kind of the way for the pioneers in abstract art. Of course, Mondrian, but also Kelly, I guess, will perhaps feature, who thought of their own art as a continuation of Picasso. So I hope you join me in welcoming Yve-Alain Bois to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for this very nice introduction. Let me make sure that I have everything. At the opening of the extraordinary exhibition, Inventing Abstraction 1910-1925, curated by Leah Dickerman at MoMA 2 years ago, I stumbled upon the American sculptor Richard Serra, who was furious. "Why did they start with Picasso?" he asked. "He has nothing to do with this." He was referring to the way one was invited into the show and introduced to the world of abstract art. If you took the elevator from the lobby of the museum, what you saw first when its doors opened was a gigantic chart of networks between artists and cities that filled up a large wall. Walking towards it, though, you could not fail to locate the veritable entrance of the show, signaled by a 1911 statement from Kandinsky in bold-faced characters, and you could not fail to notice that a single painting was given single pride of place, functioning like an emblem, but also like a sentinel. If you are anything like me, you immediately dropped the plan you had just made to examine the chart, and you rushed to that painting, wanting above all to know if it was indeed what you thought it might be, but could not ascertain from afar. The painting in question was Picasso's 1910 Woman with a Mandolin in the collection of the Museum Ludwig in Cologne. I had not been privy to Dickerman's installation design, but we had discussed the inclusion of Picasso in the show, and as a result, she had asked me to contribute to the catalogue. The first thing Dickerman and I had agreed upon was that it was a mistake, as had been the case in various recent attempts, to pretend that one could trace the origins of abstract art without taking Cubism into consideration, and particularly the Cubism of Picasso and Braque, given that, with the exception of artists belonging to the expressionist wing of abstraction, such as Kandinsky, most of the so-called pioneers of abstract art, notably Malevich and Mondrian, had been quite vocal in expounding their depth to it. Serra, to whom I reported this conversation in defense of the MoMA show, was not mollified in any way. He's very unlikely to be mollified no matter what. He probably thought this was mere academic talk, stuff for art historians. So I pulled another card from my sleeve, namely the second line of argument that Dickerman and I had developed about Picasso while she was preparing her show. We were both struck by the fact that a Spanish artist, who seemed to have no fear whatsoever, had nevertheless recoiled in front of abstraction. And if abstraction represented a jump that a daredevil like him would not take, then how much more difficult it must have been for all those who did dive in. Kandinsky's famous hesitations in 1910, 1912 had much more sense when placed in that context. True, the second argument is art historical as well, but I thought it would have more purchase on Serra, as it takes up the point of view of production, so to speak, of the struggle of the artist, and it underscores something Serra himself could not but agree with, that abstract art was something inherently difficult. That producing an abstract work of art in the early teens of the 20th century must have been nothing short of heroic, and not least that Picasso came close to painting abstractly earlier than Kandinsky did. Of course, Serra was not more convinced by this reasoning. For him, showing a Picasso at the entrance was deliberately muddying the water. On the one hand, it was doing nothing to dispel the century-old misunderstanding of Picasso as an abstract artist. On the other hand, it was presenting abstract art as if it were necessarily the result of a kind of distillation or stylization of reality, an argument for which quite a few works by Picasso, for example, The Tree from 1907, had been often used as ammunition. Serra was not entirely wrong in either count. The erroneous notion that Picasso was an abstract artist is still very common, at least among the general public, and distillation is by no means the path through which all the inventors of this art arrived at it, even though many did. But Serra was somewhat disingenuous as well, for no one having spent any time in the exhibition could leave it with the impression that it was advocating such ideas. However, in saying that Picasso had nothing to do with it, Serra had one major ally on his side, the Spanish painter himself. This doesn't mean that Serra was right, of course, but Picasso's well-known contempt for abstract art is definitely something to be reckoned with. As far as I know, there are no declarations by Picasso, either public or private, concerning abstract art during the crucial years of its early development, 1910, 1925, the years on which the Museum of Modern Art exhibition was focused. His first real attack against abstract art appears in an interview published by the critic Thériade in the newspaper L'Intransigeant in 1928. The conversation that turned on the topic of the so-called hermetic cubism of 1910-1911, and Thériade had quipped, "At the time, people said that you were doing abstraction." Rather than responding that it was a common reproach, hurling at anything that was new in art, for example, that Matisse had similarly been accused of making abstract art when he was showing Le Bonheur de Vivre in 1906, Picasso engaged in a diatribe. I quote, "I have a horror of this so-called abstract painting. What an error abstraction is. What a gratuitous idea. When you stick colors next to each other and trace lines in space that don't correspond to anything, what you are making at best is just decoration." I shall come back later to that particular moment in 1928, but let us first examine the judgment abstraction equals decoration. Needless to say, this was by then, 1928, a critical cliché in the prose of adversaries of abstract art, just as the fear that abstraction could be interpreted as gratuitous ornament had been essential in the delay between Kandinsky's theorization of abstract art and his enactment of it in painting. Much closer to Picasso, this was a line of argument taken up by his dealer, Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, in The Rise of Cubism, written in 1915-1916, and originally published in 1920. In the preface of the republication of this book in 1958, Kahnweiler would insist on the fact that it had to be treated as a historical document, since it was based on conversations he had had with artists, conversations that were still very fresh in his mind at the time of his writing. It is probably not far-fetched to imagine that some of these conversations had been with Picasso, and that a consensus between them was established on the topic of abstraction. But at the time of the interview with Thériade, perhaps even more important for Picasso than the views of Kahnweiler, from whom he was by then somewhat estranged, was his own disgust at the Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, or Exposition Art Déco, that had occurred 3 years earlier, an exhibition that he perceived as an abject devolution of the Cubist revolution into kitsch. At least, that was the way his feeling came out in conversation with Georgy Yakulov, published by the latter as Letter on Art in the Soviet art journal Ogonyok, sorry for the pronunciation, in May 1926. I quote, "Friends wanted to bring me to the exposition. You'll see Picasso, you'll see that you are the source of this all, of this architecture. You'll find yourself everywhere there. You'll recognize only the product of your labor." They probably thought they were pleasing me in speaking like that. But decorative art has nothing to do with easel painting, with the creation of a picture. The first is utilitarian, the other is a noble game. An armchair, it's something to rest on. It's a utensil, it's not art. If the identification of abstraction with decoration was a leitmotif to which Kahnweiler sadly clung all his life, Picasso, however, was more flexible in his objections. The line of argument he used most often was that the very concept of abstract art was an oxymoron. He clearly spells it out in his famous conversation with Christian Zervos in 1935. I quote, "There is no abstract art. You must always start with something. Afterwards, you can remove all appearance of reality. There is no longer any danger because the idea of the object left an indelible mark." Another line of argument that he deployed in the same conversation, and which is actually quite judicious, it was to deny the very possibility of non-figurative art as such. Nor is there any figurative or non-figurative art. All things appear to us in the form of figures. Even in metaphysics, ideas are expressed by means of figures. So you see how absurd it would be to think of painting without the images of figures. A person, an object, a circle are all figures. They act upon us more or less intensely. Finally, a third line of argument, also very clever, and that came much later, was to deny the possibility of the absence of subject matter. I quote again, "Even if the canvas is all green, so what? In that case, the subject matter is greenness. They're always a subject. It's a joke to pretend to suppress the subject. It's impossible. It's like if you said, 'Do as if I were not here.' Well, try." I don't think one could find many abstract artists saying that they wanted to expunge subject matter from their art. What they did say, often, even though they did not use those words, was that they wanted to get rid of object matter, to speak like the painter Barnett Newman, who borrowed the term from his friend, the art historian Meyer Shapiro. Most of them never tired of stressing the richness of the abstract conceptual subject matter. In any event, aside from his rather shrewd allusion to geometric abstract art as figurative, the circle, or to abstract painting, even a monochrome one as well stocked with subject matter, greenness, Picasso remained unfaltering in his conviction that the starting point of a painting must necessarily be of something, that a painting is necessarily a picture of something in a phenomenal world. This was for him the sine qua non condition for brush strokes to end up making a painting. According to François Gillot, though, he admitted to having wavered once. I quote, "I told Pablo I thought nobody could have done completely non-figurative painting better than he. I suppose so," he said. In those, and I continue the quote, "In those polyhedric cubist portraits I did in tones of white and gray and ochre beginning around 1909, there were references to natural forms, but in the early stage there were practically none. I painted them afterwards. I call them attributes. At that period, I was doing painting for its own sake. It was really pure painting, and the composition was done as a composition. It was only toward the end of a portrait that I brought in the attributes. At a certain moment, I simply put in 3 or 4 black touches and what was around those touches became a vest." After a digression concerning the grammatical meaning of the word attributes, attribut in French, which probably should have been translated for the occasion as predicate, Picasso offers his 1910 portrait of Daniel-Henri Kahnweiler as an example of what he just described. I quote again, "In its original form, it looked to me as though it were about to go up in smoke. But when I paint smoke, I want you to be able to drive a nail into it. So I added the attributes, a suggestion of eyes, the wave in the air, an earlobe, the clasped hands, and now you can." This part of the statement is perfectly consistent with the well-established narrative of the Cubist epic, based in great part on Kahnweiler's own early account. But the allusion to the pure painting, pure as without any attributes, predicates, is an obvious distortion. Either Gillot misunderstood what Picasso told her, or he found the story convenient as a means of explaining a mysterious episode in the development of his art. It was just a useful folly. He had momentarily succumbed to the temptation of art for art's sake. As is well known, the episode in question did not occur in 1909, but during the short summer that Picasso spent in Cadaqués in July-August 1910. Kahnweiler's summary is succinct. I quote, "Little satisfied, even after weeks of arduous labor, he returned to Paris in the fall with his unfinished works. But he had taken the great step. He had pierced the closed form. A new tool had been forged for the achievement of the new purpose." End of quote. That Picasso considered the canvases he brought back from Spain to be unfinished is highly dubious. At least we should not trust Kahnweiler on this point, since he had a tendency to declare works that he didn't like unfinished. And we know that he didn't like those because, according to John Richardson, he brought only one of them, by far the least radical, and most probably one of the first painted in the group, if not the first. The canvas in question is Harbor at Cadaqués, in which one can easily recognize small fishing boats and their masts, thanks also to the use of the local color, blue patches denoting the sea, an exceptional occurrence in the work of this period. That said, Kahnweiler was certainly right when noting that the 10 Cadaqués paintings still extant today were the fruit of hard labor. This is a surprising small outcome, especially when compared to the avalanche of works produced during the 4 months spent at Horta del Ebro the previous summer. Clearly, something new had emerged, whether or not it involved Kahnweiler's ideas of piercing the closed form. And there is no reason to doubt that Picasso was dissatisfied with his works, and that the source of his dissatisfaction was indeed, as has become canonical in Cubism studies, that some of these Cadaqués canvases had come dangerously close to pure abstraction. Almost as soon as he returned to Paris, Picasso resolved to change course. His portrait of Daniel-Henri Kahnweiler, which he had probably begun before his stay in Cadaqués but finished shortly afterwards, provides a template of the new direction his art was to take. I have written elsewhere about the pictorial logic that almost inevitably brought Picasso to the brink of abstraction in the summer of 1910, so I shall be succinct here. Suffice it to say that this logical development began 2 years earlier with works like Three Women, in which Picasso was attempting to map the entire visual field, thus figure and ground, with a unitary pictorial idiom, to borrow Pierre Dex's apt phrase. In early sketches for the Three Women, this compulsion can be seen in the way it translates every single body part into the tapered shape of a bobbin. But then he opted for the triangle as a unit in the final painting. This system is at first an irregular mesh, but the mesh gradually lines up with the limit of the canvas to become, at Cadaqués, an open orthogonal grid. In the quasi-abstract works of the summer 1910, Picasso tried to find out how far one could go in reducing all possible drawn marks to only one kind, which would be a product of the merging of an a priori division of the field, the grid, or geometrical partitioning of the surface, with the potentiality of the figure itself. But the linear network was not the only abstracting agent in the Cadaqués output. Another, no less important, was the freeing of chiaroscuro, that is a distribution of light and shade, from its usual denotative function. Each facet, each plane, whether included in the grid or contravening to it, is lit and shaded independently, with the effect that no solid is depicted in the round, and yet a sense of depth is still conveyed. This is what Kahnweiler alluded to when he wrote that Picasso had pierced the closed form. Picasso obviously felt that his experiment led to an impasse. That, contrary to what he would later tell Zervos, the idea of the object would not leave such an indelible mark after all, once all appearance of reality is removed. And he cut the experiment short. But while the logic that brought him to the brink of abstraction was almost inevitable, such is not the case with his recoiling. That is to say, he could have taken another route and pursued the abstract vein, and I'm not far from reading all his many statements against abstract art as ex post facto justifications. Or, to put it otherwise, one could argue that a full endorsement of abstraction would have been much more logical at this point, in 1910. At least, this is what another artist thought, a man who, like Picasso, had received an academic training and who was 9 years older than him, Piet Mondrian. In fact, Mondrian picks up the baton of abstraction around 1912-13, exactly when Picasso had left it in 1910. Most historians would not be caught dead asking the question, what if? What would have happened if Picasso had not turned his back to abstraction? What art would have emerged from such an embrace? In some ways, one could say that Mondrian provided an answer for this what-if question. At least this is the way Mondrian himself saw it. He never lost an occasion to say how much he admired Picasso's cubism, but he would always add, I quote, "Cubism did not accept the logical consequence of its own discoveries," and that was precisely what his own work was to do. Coming to the rescue. And so, with your permission, I shall indulge for a moment in a digression about the art of the Dutch painter. As Mondrian understood analytic cubism, to which one might assume he was exposed after his arrival in Paris in 1912, at least indirectly, it formally consisted in, first, a grid formation that becomes gradually more blurry before coming into contact with the edge of the canvas, and second, a restricted tonal, even palette that underscores a growing all-overness of the distribution of rectangles. This pictorial language, he thought, was particularly adequate to what he was just set as his goal, that of showing in his art the process of a kind of digitization, one could even say pixelization, of the outside world solely through the horizontal-vertical opposition which he was beginning to conceive as the mark of the universal lying behind all particular phenomena. The splendid composition number 7, 1913 at the Guggenheim Museum, is a culminating works of a series of canvases based on a tree motif. And looking, oh, sorry, I was ahead of my time. And looking at the drawings and sketches from which this painting stems, and there is some more, one can clearly see how the digitization functions. Yet, the manifest success of Mondrian's method quickly presented a big dilemma for him. Composition number 2, 1913, at the Color Museum in Otello, for example, is sometimes said to be based on a motif of trees, sometimes on that of a mill, in much a way that Picasso painting at Caracas were often assigned divergent motifs by various specialists and by the artist himself at various moments. But if the transformation of any motif was bound to result in a perfectly balanced grid, was there any sense in pursuing the experiment? Mondrian's next move in the spring of 1914 would be somewhat similar to that of Picasso in the works immediately following his Caracas crisis. He would reintroduce some representational elements in a new series based on a specific feature that was common at the time in the Paris landscape. The windowless walls revealed by the demolition of contiguous buildings, full of the ghost images of raised apartments in the form of a colorful and mainly orthogonal patchwork of wallpaper decoration. These works, there are 4 in total, differ from the previous ones in that the color is more saturated and the rectangles are larger, more individualized in size, proportion, and color, and are often left open and out of alignment. For a moment, Mondrian believed that he could be faithful to his Neoplatonic dream of unveiling the essence of things hidden behind their appearances without abandoning those appearances themselves. He thought that he could let the motif in itself do much of the work of revelation, the demolition of the walls. But this optimism was short-lived. In the last painting of this small series, the figurative elements are clearly waning. Back in Holland for a vacation, where, to his chagrin, he would be trapped for the duration of the war, Mondrian quickly shifted away from his Parisian epiphanies and returned to the method of distillation he had perfected with Composition 7 in 1913. But with a new twist. Soon after his return in his native country, he went to the artist's resort of Domburg, where he had sojourned several times, and began 3 series of drawings based on the motifs he had already worked on in the past: the sea, the thrust of a wooden pier into the ocean, and the little village church. In retrospect, it is not surprising that a superb drawing series based on the sea yielded no canvas. It proved too difficult for him to bring forth any verticality in such a vast horizontal expanse. But the pier and ocean drawings, often nicknamed Plus and Minus, and the church in Domburg drawings resulted both in major paintings, respectively Composition 10 in black and white of 1915 and Composition 1916. Nothing is more telling than the comparison between those drawings and the 2 canvases. In the drawings, whose composition is basically symmetrical, Mondrian explored the cruciform resulting from the intrusion of a vertical element, the pier, into an horizontal field, the ocean, or vice versa, resulting from the intrusion of an horizontal element, the cornice and row of squat arches, into a vertical field, the church facade. In the canvases, the cruciform is abandoned as a fixed entity. Symmetry would never reappear again in Mondrian's oeuvre after that. And we witness its simultaneous gestation and dissolution. This was perfectly caught by the young Theo van Doesburg when he saw Composition 10 in black and white in a group show at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in October 1915. In a review that would launch his friendship with Mondrian, he noted that the painter's methodical construction embodies becoming rather than being. Though van Doesburg could not have been aware of this, the phrase becoming rather than being captures an important mutation in Mondrian's thought due to his sudden exposure, via a Dutch vulgarizer, to the dialectical philosophy of Hegel. Far removed from the static world of purified essences for which Mondrian had been searching, Hegel's dialectics helped him understand what he called the fundamental opposition, what he called the fundamental position, the vertical horizontal, should be understood as a system of contradictory forces whose equilibrium is no longer achieved by mutual neutralization, but by reciprocal tension. The enduring motto he coined at the time, each element is determined by its contrary, comes directly from Hegel. The goal was no longer to encode the spectacle of the real world in geometric pattern, but to enact on canvas the laws of dialectics that govern that world. And even though composition 10 in black and white and composition 16 were still based on the distillation of a natural motive, all traces of the motive have vanished from them. It is no longer the spectacle of the world that is encoded, but the elements of the art of painting itself, line, color, plane, each reduced to basic ciphers, whose interaction constitutes a new reality, says Mondrian. With his next major canvas, composition in line dating from 1917, Mondrian will entirely forego any reliance on a natural motive, even as a starting point. As he himself would say later, he had left what he called abstraction from for the purely abstract. Now, I hope you'll forgive me for this Mondrian digression. I could have brought in other artists to the answer of the what-if question. For example, two other artists who also went through a cubist phase directly inspired by Picasso, of whom they considered themselves the true heirs. I'm speaking of Kazimir Malevich and of Vladimir Tatlin, both of whom bypassed the stage of the abstraction from that had been so crucial for Mondrian, and thus demonstrated that, as I mentioned at the outset, there were other paths to abstraction than that of the progressive distillation of a natural motive. Yet, however different the routes taken by Mondrian, Malevich, or Tatlin, they all originated in Picasso's cubism. In sum, cubism functioned as a springboard for abstraction, a springboard from which Picasso himself refused to jump. Now, as far as the reason that he didn't jump, he's probably simple-minded to attribute it to fear, as Dickerman and I had done for rhetorical reasons in our conversation with Richard Serra. But to speculate about this is just about as contrary to the task of an art historian as is the what-if type of question. So I limit myself to observing that while Picasso seems to have made up his mind once and for all at Caracas, he would nevertheless periodically revisit the possibility of abstraction throughout his career, as if to reassure and perhaps to tease himself. This happened at many moments, the first of which not long after the Caracas flop. I'm speaking of the spring of 1913, a major step in Mondrian's production, and once again, I shall be very brief on this because I've already written extensively on that moment. We are in the heyday of the so-called synthetic cubism. Picasso has already gone through his first two extraordinary series of collages, the inaugural ones from the fall of 1912, soon after he had done his talismanic guitar sculpture, and the much larger series in the winter of 1912-13. And you see the guitar actually on the wall there. It is while he was working on these collages that Picasso stumbled upon an issue that fascinated him, or actually stumbled again upon it, since it goes back to the search for a unitary system of notation that had dominated his work during the years of so-called analytical cubism. Remember, the same triangle can denote a thigh, a breast, a knee, etc. The issue in question is the polysemy of signs and the contextual nature of signification that is, and the contextual nature of signification that is concomitant with this polysemy. To put it briefly, and this is especially obvious in the 1912-13 series, Picasso becomes obsessed with what is the minimum required for a sign to be deciphered. For example, what is the smallest possible difference between the signs configuring in turn a guitar, a head, or a bottle. This difference is strictly a matter of attributes, he finds out. Put the label mark on a shape and it becomes a bottle of cognac. Turn this shape upside down, add 2 dots for the eyes, and it becomes a face. I hope you can see that this is the same thing as that, upside down. The series of head guitars, or guitar heads, on which Picasso worked in 1913 is a large corpus, with at least a dozen canvases and hundreds of sketches and collages. So where was I? Okay. So there are so many of works in this series, it's not the time here to examine in detail. So first is to say that as soon as Picasso found a minimum sign able to represent both a guitar and a head, and that this sign was past the threshold of abstraction, he was satisfied to leave his quest as that. The reason that I wanted to mention, however, briefly this episode is because I feel that it is slightly different from all those that will follow, in a sense that, unlike them, it does not seem to have occurred in response to anything in particular. The head guitar series, in other words, seems to have slowly emerged from the internal necessity of the kind of semiotic analysis to which Picasso relentlessly submitted the art of painting at the time. I have the feeling that such is not entirely the case for all the other brushes that Picasso had with abstraction during the course of his long career. As you might know, Picasso was, among other things, a very reactive artist. I had not realized to what extent until more than 15 years ago, I curated at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth an exhibition about his dialogue with Matisse from the early 30s on. While researching this topic, I had been particularly anxious with regard to the section devoted to World War II. How to even conceive of a dialogue taking place in a period when each of the two artists, totally separated for the first time in years, could not have had a precise idea of what the other was doing. I was dumbfounded to find out that each time Picasso received some news from Matisse, a phone call, a letter, also a work of his in a show, since Matisse, unlike him, was allowed to exhibit during the occupation, Picasso would immediately draw or pen something deliberately Matissean that very same day or the next, and then, as it were, move on. I believe that a pattern of this kind is often at work in Picasso's periodic little abstract pirouettes. We are not speaking of such a rapid tit for tat. Abstraction was not of the same nature as that was, I mean, his investment with abstraction was not of the same nature as that with Matisse, which carried a lot of emotional baggage. The stimulus-response rhythm was thus not that swift. There could be some delay. But a sudden landing of an abstract UFO in Picasso's production, long after he had deliberately shelved abstraction as a dead hand, should be seen as direct reactions to the particular context of their respective utterances. Those anomalous imports that, unlike what had happened in a head guitar series of 1913, seem utterly disconnected to the course of his preoccupation of the moment, lead me to think that Picasso, periodically reminded of the existence of abstract art, and perhaps rehearsing in his mind the unpleasant souvenir of the Caracas crisis, needed to eliminate this nuisance, again, by ingesting and digesting it, which is to say, by making use of it. When many of us think about Picasso, we have the tendency to imagine him as a hermit of Mougins, content to stay put and limiting his social life to the visit of a select group of intimate friends. But until he definitely migrated south in the 50s, Picasso kept abreast of what was going on in a small world of the Paris avant-garde, and he visited any exhibition that was said by friends or even by the press to be cutting edge. A good example of such a show was the exhibition Constructiviste Russe, Gabot et Pevsner, Peinture Construction, that opened at the Galerie Percier on June 19, 1924. Not only was one of the directors of the gallery, André Level, an old friend, and one who had collected Picasso's work when he was very young, but the gallery was located at 38 Rue de la Boulessie, on the very same street where Picasso was then living. Anton Pevsner described the opening of the show in a letter to his brother Naum Gabo, who could not be present. There were a lot of people, like any other exhibition. Everyone was there. Picasso came with Danevich and remained for a long time. He began to study each work in turn for a long time. He spoke with me for a long time. He was struck by your things, but he's cunning and comes when I'm not there, and there he was there again yesterday. He's especially struck by your torso and then your small construction with the two circles. Later in the letter, Pesner added in his characteristic paranoid mode, "I was not pleased by Picasso's visits. He has already ripped us off. Of this you can be certain. He does a lot of work for the theater, and it's clear that he wants from us. I'm very careful." Pesner's fear that Picasso would rip him and his brother off was fairly common at the time. Just 2 years later, Matisse even called the Spanish artist a bandit waiting in ambush in a letter to his daughter. This is of course silly, but Pesner was perfectly right in thinking that Picasso was not spending so much time in exhibition just to engage in small talk with other bystanders. The 8 constructions presented by Gabo are not easy to identify, but thanks to the remarkable work done by Colin Sanderson and Christina Loader, we can have some idea. Contrary to Pesner's testimony, I have some doubt about Picasso's interest in Gabo's 1917 torso, which are on the screen, because it seems so much indebted to Picasso's own Cubist sculpture. But Gabo's more recent column is a motif for a monument for an observatory, and above all, his construction in space lighting, which seems to be the small construction with the two circles, would not have left Picasso cold. Indeed, it seems to me that several undated sketches included in a sketchbook that was filled between March and October 1924 were made with the Gabo constructions in mind. I would even include among these Gabo-esque reminiscences the famous series of dot and line patterns drawn in Juan Lepin during the summer of 1924 and used much later as illustrations for Ambroise Vollard's 1931 deluxe edition of the Unknown Masterpieces by Balzac. This is not to say that Gabo's construction should be considered as the source of Picasso's constellations. I would rather suggest that the omnivorous Picasso was intrigued by something in these transparent objects in plastic and felt compelled to respond. His response, however, was a diversion from his own preoccupation of the moment, and so he shelved both sets of drawings for the time being. He remembered the first set in 1928 when he began thinking about the open-wire structure that would become his second proposal for the monument to Apollinaire. It was similarly refused by the committee that commissioned it, just as his first attempt had been. He remembered the second set for whatever reason when he decided to spice up with a pinch of surrealism the batch of images that Vollard had chosen in the studio as illustrations of the Balzac story, a story that they no more illustrate than the 4 classical drawings and 67 Cubist woodcuts included in the book. As I noted earlier, these kinds of very brief and eventually instrumental nods in the direction of abstract art are numerous in Picasso's career. As other examples, I could mention the kitchen of 1948 in the Museum of Modern Art, or the strange and very large grisaille version in his series of the studio La Californie. It's a painting dated from 1956. I would like to end with another of those strange short-lived incursions into the terrain of abstraction, which occurred around 1928, while Picasso was engaged in a series of canvases on the theme of the painter's studio. Actually, in order to discuss these works and the particular strategy invented by Picasso to affirm once more his victory over abstraction, I would like to invoke Matisse again, who had had his own bout of anxiety over abstraction. In a book catalogue accompanying the exhibition I curated about the dialogue between these two masters of 20th century art, I developed the following argument. While Matisse, after a decade of overproduction, was gradually grinding to a halt, there's a handful painting in 1928, even less in 1929, Picasso, with whom the senior painter had no contact in years, was missing him and decided to challenge him, to upset him by various means, in particular that of appropriating his work of the teens, so that Matisse, in a fit of jealous anger at having been robbed, and with a pang of renewed desire for his own past work, would come out of his lair and pick up the dialogue where he had left it in 1917. In this scenario, I juxtapose in 1928, The Painter and His Model, by Picasso, the Museum of Modern Art, with Matisse's 1916 Bathers by a River, and also Picasso's figure and profile of the Musée Picasso in Paris with Matisse's piano lesson from 1916. It's not surprising given that the two Matisse paintings, which Picasso had probably just seen in one-week exhibition almost exclusively devoted to them, were works in which Matisse had been trying to digest Cubism and didn't succeed. But I had also noted, to complete the dossier, that Picasso's large nude in red armchair of 1929 had enough to do with Matisse's odalisques, particularly with the odalisque with a tambourine of 1926, to be considered a critic of them. One of the things that struck me in both Picasso's 1929 large nude and in the painter and his model was the presence of an empty but framed grey rectangle that was constantly being read as a mirror. I'm not the only one to have been struck by this detail, which appears in many other work of the studio series of 1927-28. In the MoMA version, for example, or in that of the Peggy Guggenheim collection. The first to pay attention to this particular detail in the painter and his model, which has been discussed by Chris Green in relation to magic, were the editors of the journal Document, who fitted it in full page along with a reproduction of two other details as well as the whole painting in the first issue of the journal, which appeared in 1929. But what gave me some pause in my obsession to detect signs of Picasso's strategies to bring back Matisse into the fray was a direct link of this iconographic element to Matisse's oniric Blue Window of 1913, a work which I admit Picasso had not been able to see for quite a while, as it had been snatched by Karl Ernst Austhaus upon completion, but which he might have remembered for its praise and reproduction by Apollinaire, who was very much on his mind then in 1928, in his journal Les Soirées de Paris, under the title La glace sans teint, the mirror without silvering. It is also under that title that the founder of Surrealism, André Breton, celebrated Matisse's painting, claiming that it was the work that had initiated his interest in art and prompted him to write with Philippe Soupeau, under its spell, his very first piece of automatic poetry. The poem La glace sans teint was first published in a journal in 1919, and then again at the opening piece of Breton and Soupeau's The Magnetic Fields in 1920, which really marked the birth of the Surrealist movement. Of course, by 1926, when he published his statement about that there was a painting that had led him to write about art. By 1926, Breton had become very critical of Matisse, but of the Matisse of the 20s, calling him a discouraging and discouraged lion in a second installment of the Surrealism and painting, and doubting that he would ever rise again from his slumber. I do not think that these moves would have passed unnoticed by Picasso, but I want to look again at Matisse's Blue Window from another angle. Let's indulge in pure anachronism and imagine for a moment that Matisse's non-reflective mirror is a monochrome, a frame monochrome, that is, something akin to Malevich's Red Square of 1915. I say anachronism to prevent any frontal attack, but actually have some backup encouragement from the horse's mouth. For example, this famous quotation by Gino Severini, dating from 1917. Matisse showed me a sketch one day that he made from life on the street of Tangiers. In the foreground, a wall painted blue. This blue influenced everything else, and Matisse had lent it the most importance he could without compromising the objective construction of the landscape. Despite this, he had to acknowledge that he had not captured a fraction of the intensity of the blue, that is, the sensorial intensity that this blue produced in him. He told me that in order to offload this blue sensation, which predominated over all others, he would have had to paint the entire painting blue, like a wall painter. But if he had resorted to this knee-jerk reaction, which would have been important only at the moment of the sensation, he would not have achieved the work of art. And then there's also Matisse's French window at Collioure from 1914 to confirm that the possibility of the monochrome or the blank plane loomed quite large for Matisse during the years he was trying to learn the language of Cubism and before he retreated to Nice in order to redo Impressionism for more than a decade. This is true as well for the possibility of abstraction, as can be seen in a quasi-realist painting called Shaft of Sunlight, The Woods of Trivaux from 1917. But if the reference to Malevich is admittedly anachronistic with regard to the Matisse of the teens, is it totally so for the Picasso of the late 20s? Again, I'm not claiming, of course, that Malevich could in any way be the source of Picasso's fascination for non-reflective mirrors in his studio series, but perhaps a spectre of abstraction is. Of abstraction, that is, to repeat myself, or something he would always keep at bay, but which he needed from time to time to tease out in order to reassure himself. By the mid-20s, abstract art was emerging as one of the two avant-garde contenders in painting and sculpture to fill the void left by the academization of Cubism. The other was Surrealism. The work of the Russian avant-garde, gradually revealed after the end of the blockade against Russia in 1922, and particularly at the Art Deco International Fair of 1925 in Paris, had put to shame the middle-brow modernism favored by the French cultural establishment. As I noted at the outset, Picasso was utterly disgusted by the transformation of Cubism into bibelots at the fair, but it is hard to imagine that he was not impressed by the Soviet pavilion of Melnikov and Rodchenko, one of the very few uncompromisingly modernist ensembles at the exhibition, together with Le Corbusier's pavilion of l'Esprit Nouveau. In fact, we know that he was interested. On April 2nd, 1925, Alexandre Rodchenko writes from Paris to his wife. Pevsner said today that Picasso really wants to see me, as said in a few days. Besides that, books about abstract art were beginning to appear. Malevich's Bauer's book, for example, dates from 1927, which patrons such as the Vicomte de Noailles were becoming interested in Mondrian. In 1925, the Vicomte bought the Losange painting, which is now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And indeed, Mondrian's work was becoming much more visible. First, his paintings, which he exhibited in numerous group shows, but also in one-man shows, held just as Picasso was engaged in his studio series. And then there were also the photos of Mondrian's studio that were beginning to circulate in many little magazines, along with his essays prophesizing the dissolution of art into architecture. Not only little magazines, that is, I should add, but even Cahiers d'Art, the journal that Christian Zervos was then gradually transforming into an organ almost entirely dedicated to Picasso's glory. In short, abstraction from 1925 on was gaining momentum. Now, what does any of that has to do with Picasso's monochromatic mirror without silvering? Lots have been written on Picasso's fear of mirrors, the legend having that it began after he had received the news of Apollinaire's death while drawing his self-portrait in front of a mirror. Another legend is that he was shaving. But it seems to me that the blank mirror in the painting and his model stands for painting as such, for the death of painting as a form of representation, for its horrifying descent into the realm of the diagram or an abstraction from which the only rescue would be the material world of objects. I've always been surprised by the description of the profile etched, indeed gouged, on the canvas of the painter and his model as realistic. Even though most scholars who use this term about it, I've also noted its diagrammatic, indexical nature akin to a shadow, as well as its direct link to all the other profiles of this type that appear in contemporary paintings by Picasso. At first, this profile was clearly a cast shadow painted in tandem with the face to which it refers in the dance or the statuary of 1925. But soon it became unmoored, taking an uncanny life of its own, as in the figure of profile of 1928 that I mentioned before. Among all the paintings of 1928-29, in which his ghostly profile turns up, two particularly stand out for the superimposition of the spectral shadow and the blank mirror. But I shall also add to the dossier a painting that belongs to another group, Picasso's second round with regard to the theme of the painter in his studio. It is a painter from 1934, where both cutout profile and monochrome canvas, Matisse's Blue Dream, are conspicuously represented as inert in front of the pink nude, or odalisque, if you will, wriggling on an armchair. To indulge in ecological studies is not my cup of tea, but in the present case, I have a hard time preventing myself from seeing this wandering profile as a phantom of painting itself, a sign of absence, at times shown as standing for the model, at times as standing for the painter itself, as in the work 1934, but more often than not, just floating, a being without a flesh, uninhabited, a menacing souvenir maybe, or perhaps even worse, the announcement of the inevitable death of painting as art, unable to sustain the onslaught of abstraction. And it is in view of such a melancholic reading that I persist in the idea that Picasso needed to call back Matisse, to bring him on to resume their dialogue, feeling that together the two of them might be able to defeat the plague of abstraction once and for all.